Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk, a German perspective, July 1943. The Eastern Front hangs in a tense balance. In the aftermath of the catastrophe at Stalingrad and the bloody fighting at Kharkov, Adolf Hitler pins his hopes on one bold stroke to regain the initiative. The plan is Operation Citadel, an ambitious offensive to encircle the huge Soviet bulge around the city of Kursk. German troops, tanks and aircraft mass for what they believe will be a decisive battle. The air is thick with summer heat and dust. Engines growl and officers bark last-minute orders. Across the steppe, the Red Army waits in deep fortifications. The stage is set for the largest armoured clash in history. High Command's dilemma. At Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, a drama of strategy unfolds weeks before the battle. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, paces anxiously in his Wolfschanze command bunker. He is haunted by recent defeats, yet eager to deliver a knockout blow. Around a map table, his top generals gather for a crucial meeting. Among them stands Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, fresh from a counter-offensive victory at Kharkov in March. Manstein is a bold strategist with a keen eye for opportunity. It was he who first proposed pinching off the Kursk salient. He believes a swift attack, sooner rather than later, could catch the Soviets off guard and destroy dozens of their divisions. Opposing him in this debate is General Walter Model, commander of 9th Army in the north. Model, nicknamed Hitler's fireman for his defensive prowess, has inspected the Soviet lines and grimly reports a well-fortified enemy. He warns that the Red Army has turned the salient into a fortress bristling with new anti-tank weapons and endless minefields. An offensive now, Model cautions, could be a bloody grind. Hitler listens, his face taut. At his side is General Heinz Guderian, the father of Germany's Panzer Arm, recently reinstated as Inspector General of Armoured Troops. Guderian is deeply sceptical of attacking here. To him, the Kursk operation threatens to squander Germany's hard-to-replace tank forces for little gain. Why do you want to attack in the east at all this year? Guderian asks pointedly. How many people even know where Kursk is? It's a matter of profound indifference to the world whether we hold Kursk or not. Hitler, usually impatient with dissent, surprises the room with a candid admission. Whenever I think of this attack, my stomach turns over. Also present is General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff. Zeitzler, energetic and determined, supports Manstein's idea of striking the salient. He and Manstein argue that delaying only gives the Soviets more time to dig in. Across the table, Albert Speer, the armaments minister, sits in on the discussion as well. Speer, like Guderian, opposes the offensive. He has laboured to boost tank production and fears that a premature attack will bleed Germany's new panzer units dry, ruining plans to build up reserves. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Centre, Model's superior, adds his voice in favour of an attack but is inclined to trust his 9th Army commander's judgment about timing. The debate grows heated. Manstein and Zeitzler press for a swift citadel in May before the Soviets entrench further. Guderian and Speer counter that Citadel should be cancelled entirely, or at least postponed until Germany has far more armour. Hitler is torn. He craves a great victory to restore German morale and demonstrate Nazi willpower. In his mind, Kursk could be the moment for the army. Recalling how the Nazi Party's sheer stubbornness overcame setbacks in its rise to power. But memories of Stalingrad's ruins still linger. At last, after hours of weighing his general's advice, Hitler makes a fateful choice. Operation Citadel will go forward, but not yet. He decides on a compromise, a delay to gather more forces and new weapons. We will wait until June, he declares, expecting fresh units of the new Tiger heavy tanks to arrive, along with a surprise weapon he's eager to field. The Panzerjäger Ferdinand, a massive tank destroyer armed with a formidable 88mm gun. These, he believes, will smash through any Soviet defences. Manstein and others protest the delay. Every day, Soviet defences only grow stronger, but Hitler overrules them. Citadel is postponed, first to mid-June, then into early July. Privately, he admits to an aide, "We will only attack when everything is ready." The internal conflict at the top remains sharp. Guderian privately fumes at what he calls a misguided offensive. "Our tank build-up is being frittered away," he laments. Model steels himself to attack despite his misgivings, while Manstein chafes at the lost opportunity for a swift strike. Hitler, for his part, spends the interim reassuring himself and his entourage that iron will and new technology will bring victory. Propaganda trumpets the coming battle as a chance to avenge Stalingrad. The German High Command's die is cast. They will stake everything on a colossal assault at Kursk, hoping to claw back the initiative on the Eastern Front. Plans and preparations. All through June 1943, German forces assemble for Citadel. The Kursk salient, a bulge kilometres long and kilometres deep into the German lines, is to be attacked from two sides. Army Group Centre under Klug will strike from the north with Model's 9th Army, while Army Group South under Manstein strikes from the south with General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and a flank attack by Army. Detachment Kampf on the eastern side. The objective, meet near Kursk, encircle the Soviet armies in the bulge and annihilate them. If successful, up to 5 Soviet field armies could be trapped. This, the Germans hope, would cripple the Red Army's ability to launch its own summer offensives and buy Germany precious breathing room in the east. German staffs refine their battle plan meticulously. Intelligence indicates the Soviets have around 1,000,000 men and over, tanks in and around the salient, a daunting concentration. In response, the Germans gather almost 800,000 men, about 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,000 aircraft for Citadel, a mighty force, though smaller than the Soviet defence. Divisions are refitted and replenished. The best units in the Wehrmacht are assigned to spearhead the attack. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army fields the elite 2 SS Panzer Corps under General Paul Hauser, composed of 3 Krakwaffen SS divisions, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, each outfitted with over 100 tanks and self-propelled guns. Alongside them, in general, Otto von Nobelsdorf's XLVI Panzer Corps is the famous Panzergrenadier Division Großdeutschland, the Army's pride, reinforced with a company of new heavy tanks. Army Detachment Kampf, on the flank, adds more panzer divisions, such as TH and TH Panzer, to protect Hoth's right and help encircle from the east. In the north, Model's 9th Army must punch through heavily fortified terrain with several Panzer Corps, XLVI, XLI, Panzer Corps and infantry divisions in support. Model has fewer tanks than Manstein, but is allocated something unique, the Ferdinand tank destroyers. 90 of these lumbering behemoths, later known as Elephant, have been deployed in 2 battalions. With M&M of frontal armour and high-velocity M&M cannons, the Ferdinands can obliterate any Soviet tank at long range. However, they have a critical flaw: no machine guns for close defence, leaving them vulnerable to enemy infantry if unescorted. Behind the lines, new machines arrive and crews train feverishly. Hitler's insistence on using his latest technology means the Panther tank will see its debut at Kursk. The Panther is a sleek, modern medium tank with sloped armour and a powerful long-barrelled M&M gun capable of killing TS at range. Guderian, though, has grave concerns The Panther is so new that many technical bugs remain. Nonetheless, an entire brigade of Panthers, over of them, is formed under the command of General Decker and attached to Grossdeutschland and other units in the south. The venerable Panzer IV, now upgunned with a high-velocity cannon, remains the workhorse of the panzer divisions, reliable and numerous. And then there are the Panzer VI Tigers. These heavy tanks, with their thick armour and the dreaded M&M gun, have already proven formidable in combat. 2 independent heavy tank battalions, each with about Tigers, are assigned to the attack, one in the north and one in the south. And additional companies of Tigers reinforce key divisions like Grossdeutschland and the SS Corps. German tank crews have confidence in the Tiger. Its shell can knock out a Soviet T from over a kilometre away, often before the T can even penetrate the Tiger's hide. German logistics also gear up for the offensive. Supply officers stockpile ammunition, fuel, and spare parts for weeks. Trains and convoys haul thousands of tons of shells, gasoline, and rations to forward depots. Each panzer division will consume vast quantities of fuel each day. Keeping the panzers fueled and armed is a daunting task. Maintenance units double-check engines and running gear. By early July, German mechanized units around Kursk are at peak strength on paper. What cannot be quantified is the weariness of the men. Many of these troops have been fighting continuously for 2 years. Still, spirits are cautiously high. They know this is a make-or-break effort. Propaganda has dubbed some formations the largest tank army in the world. Veterans joke grimly that they've heard this before, but they load up and prepare to do their duty. Opposite them, unbeknownst to the Germans, the Soviets are not just waiting passively. Stalin and his generals, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and Vatutin, among them, have learned of German intentions through intelligence. For months, the Red Army has turned the Kursk salient into a fortress of terrifying depth. Civilian labourers and soldiers have dug trenches, tank traps, and gun emplacements. The Soviets lay an estimated 500,000 mines or more. Long belts of anti-tank mines densely carpet likely German approach routes, with equally thick fields of anti-personnel mines to slow accompanying infantry. Barbed wire entanglements stretch for miles. Anti-tank artillery is positioned in layered pack-front kill zones. There are 8 fortified defensive lines, one behind the other, extending almost miles deep. The first 3 belts are heavily manned. Behind them are operational reserves and counterattack forces. The Soviets plan to absorb the German blow, then transition to their own offensives. Every passing day of German delay has allowed them to strengthen this defensive trap. But on the German side, this reality is only dimly suspected. Some aerial reconnaissance has revealed extensive defences. Yet many German commanders remain optimistic that their superior tactics and new weapons will prevail. As July begins, the weather turns hot and dry, ideal conditions for armour. The offensive is set to commence in the early hours of July 5, 1943. On the night of July 4th, final prayers are murmured and letters scribbled home. Tank engines idle quietly in assembly areas. Orders crackle over radios. German artillery batteries range their targets. In the darkness, some elite German combat engineers crawl forward on their bellies between the lines, especially in the south, to stealthily clear lanes through Soviet minefields. Knives in teeth, wire cutters in hand, they clip barbed wire and remove mines under the noses of Soviet sentries, preparing safe paths for the morning attack. The fate of Hitler's Reich may well hinge on what happens when dawn breaks. The attack begins dawn of July 5th. Before first light on July, silence gives way to thunder. At Hours just before dawn, the Soviet defenders suddenly unleash a preemptive artillery barrage onto the German start lines. They have detected signs of the impending assault and seek to disrupt it. Shells whistle down, exploding amid the German formations. Men duck for cover as dirt and shrapnel fly. The German schedule is briefly thrown into confusion, but then, right on, the Germans respond with an earth-shaking bombardment of their own. Thousands of guns, mortars and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers open up in unison. The night sky turns orange with constant flashes. The roar is deafening. Operation Citadel has begun. For over an hour, waves of shells pound Soviet forward positions. Trenches collapse, barbed wire is shredded, and minefields erupt in gouts of flame and smoke. Then, as dawn's light creeps over the horizon, the armoured spearheads advance. Tanks and assault guns surge forward from their waiting areas, infantry riding on hulls or running alongside. The air is soon filled with the drone of aircraft engines. The Luftwaffe soars into action to support the ground attack. Stuka dive bombers, Jewess emblazoned with black crosses, swoop down to plaster Soviet bunkers and artillery with screaming bombs. Above them, swarms of German fighters, BFS and FWS's duel with Soviet Yakovlev and Lavochkin fighters, clearing the skies for the bombers and strafing any targets of opportunity. A vast combined arms assault is underway, hammering the Soviet first defensive line from ground and air. On the northern front, Model's 9th Army attacks across a 45-kilometre front toward the cities of Maloarkhangelsk and Ponyri. Under cloudy early light, Panzer III and IV tanks, Stug 3 assault guns and Tiger heavy tanks grind forward through no man's land, followed by grenadiers. They immediately encounter intense resistance. The Soviet Central Front, under General Rokossovsky, has concentrated dense defences here. German tanks find themselves entering killing fields covered by well-hidden anti-tank guns. The crack of armour-piercing shells soon joins the cacophony. In many sectors, the Germans advance behind rolling barrages, but Soviet minefields funnel their movements. Within hours, smoke covers the battlefield and visibility shrinks. One prong of the 9th Army's attack pushes toward a small rail junction village called Ponyri, which will earn a deadly nickname, Little Stalingrad. Another prong heads toward the high ground near Olkovatka, behind the Soviet lines. Leading 9th Army's charge are several panzer divisions and assault infantry units, including the TH and ND infantry and the TH Panzer Division. They make initial progress, penetrating a few miles into the first Soviet defensive belt. German combat engineers frantically clear paths through minefields under fire. Some Tiger tanks spearhead the formations, using their thick armour to shrug off frontal hits. In one sector, Tiger crews claim dozens of enemy tanks knocked out from long range, their M&M guns booming across the fields. But elsewhere, the attack stalls in a storm of fire. Soviet gunners target the flatter belly armour of German tanks as they crest ridges. Tracks and road wheels are blown apart by mines and shells. By nightfall of the first day in the north, 9th Army has only managed to push about 5-6 miles into the Red Army lines, far short of a breakthrough. The cost has been high. Over 1,000 German soldiers lie dead or missing, and several thousand more are wounded on this day alone. Worryingly, many irreplaceable panzers and assault guns are also smoking wrecks on the steppe. The formidable Soviet defences have exacted a price for every yard gained. The Southern Front tells a somewhat different tale in the opening hours. Here the terrain is more open and rolling, favouring armoured manoeuvre. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army strikes northward from the Belgorod area, aiming toward the city of Oboyan and ultimately Kursk beyond. Hauser's 2 SS Panzer Corps is at the centre of the attack with the army's strongest concentration of armour. In the dim morning light, the three SS divisions advance nearly side by side across a 12-kilometre front. 42 Tiger tanks, painted in yellow-brown camouflage, take the lead in wedge formation. Behind each Tiger, like packs behind a lead lion, follow platoons of Panzer IVs, Panzer IIIs and self-propelled assault guns in an arrowhead Panzerkeil formation. Grenadiers and sappers huddle behind the tanks or in armoured half-tracks, ready to jump out and attack trenches or obstacles. The men of Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions are hardened veterans, some wearing the all-black uniforms of panzer crews, others the field grey of panzer grenadiers, all with the SS Lightning Rune insignia. Engines revving, they plunge forward into the Soviet Voronezh front's defences. Almost immediately, the Panther tanks attached to Großdeutschland and the WWII Panzer Corps run into trouble on Hoth's left flank. As the Großdeutschland division presses forward, one of its panzer regiments gets bogged down in a massive minefield and marshy ground near a stream. A whole company of shiny new Panthers suddenly finds itself in disarray. 36 Panthers are immobilised in mines or by mechanical breakdowns within the first hours. The regiment's advance halts as Soviet anti-tank guns zero in. Several Panthers burst into flames after hits to their flanks or engine decks. The brand-new tanks are proving alarmingly prone to engine fires. German engineers move up under a hail of fire to clear lanes and recover the damaged machines. Casualties mount as men sprint through explosions to attach tow cables or detonate path-clearing charges. Eventually, paths are cleared and the Großdeutschland formation resumes movement, but precious time and momentum have been lost. The new Panthers, meant to be a cutting-edge advantage, have shown a disastrous debut. Watching the smoke rise from crippled Panthers, a worried staff officer mutters that General Guderian's fears were justified. The Panthers were not ready for prime time. Elsewhere on the southern battlefield, German armour fares better. The Leibstandarte division on the left of the SS Corps pushes through the first Soviet defensive belt by mid-morning. They capture the village of Bykovka after fierce fighting. The Das Reich division in the centre encounters a spirited counterattack around noon. Out of the haze emerge some tanks of the Soviet St. Guards tank army, charging straight at them. A wild melee ensues across the fields. Soviet tankers, in a bold move, race in among the German panzers to negate the Tigers' range advantage. Dozens of TS and German tanks duel at close quarters, kicking up dust that mingles with acrid smoke. Panzer IVs and Stug assault guns manoeuvre frantically to get clear shots. After 4 hours of battle, the smoking hulks of some 40 Soviet tanks litter the plain, the rest withdraw. The SS men have taken losses too, but their advance resumes. By evening on July, elements of Das Reich and Leibstandarte have reached the outer edge of the second Soviet defensive belt. The Totenkopf division, on the Corps' right flank, has lagged behind. Its sector was hindered by a tributary of the northern Donets River and marshy terrain. Totenkopf's tanks struggled to find fords and came under heavy fire. Progress was slow and costly. This exposed the IRSS Panzer Corps' flanks somewhat, but overall Hoth's forces in the south have driven a deep wedge into the Soviet TH Guards Army's first line. That night, as exhausted crews refuel and rearm their panzers under the moonlight, there is cautious optimism among the Germans in the southern sector. They have taken about casualties and lost a number of tanks, but the first day has yielded a significant penetration, up to kilometres deep in places. The Soviet first defensive line here is breached across a broad front. Night falls on July 5th, with battles still raging in pockets. Repair crews work feverishly by flickering lamplight, patching up damaged panzers. The sounds of clanking tools and barked orders mix with distant gunfire. Medical orderlies carry the wounded back to aid stations. German logistics swing into action. Supply trucks rumble forward with fuel and ammunition. At forward airfields, ground crews refuel Messerschmitt fighters and rearm Stukas for the next day's sorties. Both friend and foe know that this is only the beginning. Citadel will be a battle of attrition and endurance as much as manoeuvre. Grinding battles in the north, Poniry and Olkovatka. By July, and the character of the battle in the northern sector becomes a brutal slog. Model, realizing the depth of Soviet defences, concentrates his Ninth Army's efforts on two key points: the village of Poniry Station and the heights near Olkovatka. If these can be taken, a breakthrough might still be possible. The fight for Poniry turns into a miniature Stalingrad. This small town, centred on a rail station and a school building, is heavily fortified by the Soviet Th Rifle Division. German infantry from the 78th Sturm Assault Division, supported by tanks from 9th Panzer and assault guns, launch repeated assaults into Poniry streets. The first assault on July 6 fails under withering fire. Soviet soldiers, many armed with submachine guns, fight tenaciously from cellars and trenches. House-to-house combat rages as grenades and flamethrowers are employed to clear bunkers. On July 7th, Model throws in more troops, and by sheer weight of effort, the Germans gain a foothold, seizing half of Poniry after extremely bloody fighting. The railway station building changes hands multiple times. Soviet counterattacks, including tanks at point-blank range down the streets, force the Germans out of parts of the town by the next morning. It is attack and counterattack, block by block. One hillock near Poniry, designated Hill 253.5, becomes infamous. It is assaulted and reassaulted so often that troops dub it the Graveyard Hill. Casualties mount horrifyingly on both sides. Men fight in scorched wheat fields, now strewn with corpses and wreckage. A German war correspondent notes in his diary that Poniry looks like a vision of hell, a burning ruin with charred bodies in every trench. Still, by July the Germans managed to secure most of Poniry at last, though Soviet shells continue to rain upon it. The troops are astonished at the resilience of the Soviet defence. It is a battle of attrition rather than manoeuvre, something the Germans never wanted. Simultaneously, just east of Poniry, German units assault the second defensive belt at Olkovatka, a crucial height. On July, and Model commits about tanks and assault guns from 3 panzer divisions, ND, Tied and Th Panzer, in a massive push toward Olkovatka and the village of Teplo. The Luftwaffe, seeking to tip the scales, throws in every available aircraft to support this attack. Stukas dive en masse. Heinkel and Henschel ground attack planes strafe and rocket Soviet strongpoints. Bombs carve craters across Soviet lines. Under this steel umbrella, German panzers roll forward, engines roaring. They penetrate into the Soviet second belt. Briefly, hopes rise that a breakthrough is imminent, but it is not to be. The Soviets have concentrated powerful anti-tank defences around Olkovatka, including batteries of the lethal M&M and M&M anti-tank guns. As the German armoured wedge pushes up the slopes, they encounter withering fire from well-camouflaged guns and dug-in TS used as fixed turrets. Tanks explode one after another. German crews, desperate, attempt to manoeuvre and find flanking routes, only to hit more mines. Soviet Katyusha rockets scream down, blanketing assembly areas with deadly bursts of shrapnel. In spite of all efforts, the attack on Olkovatka fails. By July, the German northern offensive has ground to a halt. The furthest penetrations are only a few kilometres into the second belt and very narrow, effectively nothing more than salients filled with wrecked vehicles. Model's Ninth Army is exhausted and bled white. The combat around Ponieri and Olkovatka has cost thousands of German casualties and the loss of many of their precious tanks for no decisive result. The Soviet defence is battered but unbroken. On July, Field Marshal Klug, Army Group Centre commander, meets with Model and Panzer Corps commanders like General Joachim Lemelsen and Joseph Harp. They soberly conclude that 9th Army lacks the strength to break through. The Soviet defences are too deep, and German infantry is suffering immensely trying to storm entrenched positions. Yet Kluge insists they must keep pressure on the enemy. Why? Because in the south, Manstein's forces are still pushing forward, and any easing off in the north might let the Soviets shift reserves southward. So Klug orders 9th Army to continue local attacks, a grim task with slim prospect of success. The battle in the north becomes a holding action, effectively to pin Soviet forces so they cannot redeploy. Rokossovsky, the Soviet general facing Model, likewise shifts units to meet the crisis at Ponieri and Olkovatka, fearing a German breakthrough there. By July, both sides recognise that the German northern thrust has culminated. The front there stabilises, with Germans dug in on the outskirts of Ponieri and Soviets clinging to their bastions elsewhere. In the coming days, events elsewhere will overtake this front. For now, the exhausted German soldiers in 9th Army continue fighting minor actions, but many privately realise Citadel in the north has failed. The battlefield is a wasteland of charred tanks, shattered guns, and unburied dead. Ponieri's ruins testify to the futility of the advance. As one grenadier writes in a letter, each yard was paid for with streams of blood. Yet unknown to these men, relief for them and disaster for the whole German plan is fast approaching from an unexpected direction. The Soviets are about to go on the offensive in the north. On July, even as Citadel still rages, the Red Army launches Operation Kutuzov against the German flank at Orel, threatening to encircle Model's 9th Army from the rear. The pendulum is swinging. Thunder in the south, the drive toward Prokhorovka. In the southern sector, the first week of battle, July, is a tale of intense armoured thrusts, Soviet counterblows and narrowing opportunities. After the initial breach of the first defensive line on July, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army continues to push relentlessly. July and see heavy combat as the Germans advance toward their next major geographic objective, the town of Oboyan, which guards the road to Kursk. The terrain south of Oboyan is cut by little streams and gullies, but mostly it is open farmland, ideal for tank warfare. The Soviets, however, have laid multiple belts of defences here as well, and have stationed strong reserves in depth. Hauser's 2 SS Panzer Corps makes the main effort. Each day, the 3 SS divisions grind forward a few kilometres, blasting through bunker after bunker. Das Reich and Leibstandart take turns leading assaults. Panzer Grenadiers attack Soviet trench lines in close coordination with tanks and assault guns, using flamethrowers and grenades to clear dugouts. Soviet artillery is very active and casualties mount under its shelling. Every village becomes a fortress. Names like Yakovlevo, Luchki and Teterevino are fiercely defended by Soviet Guards rifle units until tanks, or Stukas, literally pulverize them to rubble. German momentum remains steady, if slower than hoped. By July 8th, the SS Corps has pushed roughly 25 kilometres north of the start line, now well into the Soviet second defensive belt. However, the cost is growing. Many panzers have been damaged or destroyed by the constant fighting. Maintenance crews labour each night to recover and repair as many as possible. At this point, perhaps half of the Panthers are out of action, mostly due to mechanical breakdown. Still, the bulk of the German Panzer IVs and Tigers are intact and pressing on. On the German left flank, Nobelsdorf's XLVI Panzer Corps including Grossdeutschland Division and 3rd and 11th Panzer Divisions, has been advancing parallel to the SS, albeit more slowly after the Day 1 minefield fiasco. By July, R&D Panzer Division and Grossdeutschland succeed in capturing the town of Getzovka, and on July they take Dubrova and reach positions near a village called Mikhailovka. These gains help widen the German penetration. On the far right, Army Detachment Kempf's 3 Panzer Corps, commanded by General Werner Kempf under Manstein's overall direction, has the task of advancing northwest to eventually meet the SS Corps near the town of Prokhorovka. Kempf's forces, e.g. T and H Panzer Division and the reinforced Panzer, face tough going initially. They must cross the northern Donets River and clear the enemy from the eastern flank. It takes until July for Kempf's units to force a crossing at some points and begin moving toward the area east of Prokhorovka. This delay means the SS Corps' right flank is somewhat exposed for a few days, causing Hauser and Manstein anxiety. Nonetheless, German progress to the north continues inexorably. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, alarmed by the depth of the German penetration in the south, rushes in their armoured reserves. They have a powerful formation waiting in the wings, General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, with hundreds of T-34 and T-70 tanks, positioned farther north behind the front. As the Germans close in on the last defensive line before open country, Soviet commanders decide it's time to counterattack in force. Marshal Zhukov and General Vatutin, Voronezh front commander, coordinate a massive counterstroke. Starting on July, and waves of Soviet tanks and mechanized corps are thrown against the advancing Germans. In one engagement on July, elements of Soviet Saint Tank Army and ND Tank Corps slam into the flank of WWII Panzer Corps west of the village of Pokrovka. A swirling melee results, with mixed units of panzers and TS battling at close range among rolling hills and smoking fields. The Luftwaffe, still maintaining air superiority, pounces on these Soviet tank columns from above, bombing and strafing relentlessly, knocking out dozens of Soviet vehicles. Even so, the sheer number of Soviet tanks creates crisis points along the front. Manstein and Hoth, however, have anticipated such counterattacks. Their plan has been to draw in and destroy the Soviet armoured reserves in a mobile battle once the initial defensive belts were breached. Now that moment seems at hand. Despite heavy Soviet attacks, the Germans generally beat them back with concentrated anti-tank fire and tactical air support. One notable clash occurs on July near a village called Selskoye. There, a battalion of Tiger tanks from Leibstandart, commanded by the famed tank ace Michael Wittmann, ambushes a brigade of Soviet TS at long range. In open terrain, the Tigers pick off the charging Ts one by one with deadly M&M shots. It's reported that Wittmann's company alone destroys dozens of enemy tanks that day, with minimal losses to themselves. Such tactical victories bolster German confidence that the Soviet counterthrusts can be blunted. By the end of July, Hauser's 2 SS Panzer Corps has fought its way to the vicinity of Prokhorovka, a name that will soon enter the annals of history. Prokhorovka is a small farming town, but it sits on important high ground by the Sel River, and a rail line runs through it. More importantly, it is where Rotmistrov's TH Guards tank army is assembling to strike back. On the night of July 11th, the vanguards of Leibstandarte Division are within 3 kilometres of Prokhorovka's southern outskirts. The Waffen-SS men can see the church spires of the town through their field glasses as the sun sets. They also detect ominous signs, the rumble of engines and movement of large Soviet forces ahead. Soviet columns have been streaming into the area, tank brigades, mechanized infantry, self-propelled guns. Rotmistrov is concentrating nearly tanks for a grand counter-offensive the next day. The Germans intend to seize Prokhorovka on the 12th regardless, to secure a bridgehead beyond the Psel. Unbeknownst to them, they are on a collision course with an oncoming armoured wave. On the German right flank, a bit south of Prokhorovka, Army Detachment Kempf finally achieves a breakthrough on the night of July. The TH Panzer Division executes a daring night assault, surprising Soviet defenders and crossing a tributary of the Donets. By the early hours of July, Kempf's lead elements begin to push northwest toward Prokhorovka from the southeast. The plan is for Kempf's forces to link up with the II SS Panzer Corps, encircling the Soviet 69th Army in the process. The jaws of the southern pincer are starting to close. Manstein believes that one more big effort could finally open up the path to Kursk. The Soviet armoured reserves are now engaged. If the Germans can destroy them here, Citadel might yet deliver a strategic success. The climactic clash at Prokhorovka, July. Dawn at Prokhorovka. A thin mist lies over the wheat fields and gently rolling plains around the town. To the southwest, poised along ridges and behind scrubby tree lines, are the tank brigades of Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. To the south, arrayed across a series of low rises, are the panzer groups of Haus's SS Panzer Corps. This is the showdown both sides have anticipated. Before first light, SS panzer crews climb into their vehicles, load shells and rev engines for the attack they expect to launch. In the Soviet lines, tank commanders of the TH and TH Tank Corps tighten the straps on their leather helmets and ready their formations to charge. At hours, as the sun edges over the horizon, an enormous Soviet artillery barrage erupts. Hundreds of guns and Katyusha rocket launchers saturate the areas where German tanks are massing. An ocean of noise rolls over the steppe. Hot on the heels of this bombardment, at around Moscow time or German time, Rotmistrov gives the code word over radio: "Steel, steel, steel." This is the order to attack. With a loud roar, massed Soviet armour comes forward in waves. From the high ground east of Prokhorovka, the Germans behold a startling sight. Scores of Tate tanks and lighter TS, advancing at full tilt, line abreast, throwing up plumes of dust. Soviet tank crews push their machines to maximum speed, determined to close the distance quickly. Many carry Red Army infantry clinging to the hulls, riflemen of the Guards, airborne divisions hitching a ride to battle. The Battle of Prokhorovka has begun, an epic collision of armour at point-blank range. The advancing Soviet tanks split into several prongs as they approach. One group of about 150 Soviet tanks hurtles directly toward the positions of Leibstandarte Division west of Prokhorovka. Another group swings further south, aiming to hit Totenkopf Division, which is moving in from the northwest. Yet another force targets Das Reich Division to the southwest of the town. The German plan for the day, ironically, was to have Totenkopf swing behind Prokhorovka from the north, while Leibstandarte and Das Reich awaited that manoeuvre to then storm the town. But the Soviet preemption means the SS divisions now must react defensively. German tank gunners climb into their turrets and begin firing at extreme range, trying to thin out the charging Soviet ranks. Tigers and Panzer IVs pick off some TSAT, meters, bright flashes and black smoke mark direct hits. But the Soviet tide does not stop. The T-34 seconds are now within a few hundred meters. Many Soviet crews intentionally ram through the German lines, even attempting to physically collide with German tanks. Close combat is joined, turret to turret, muzzle to muzzle. The scene turns into chaos. Dust, smoke, and the churned earth obscure vision. Tanks maneuver wildly to flank enemies or avoid pits. Some Soviet T-34 seconds, with superior speed, managed to burst into the rear areas of the German positions, overrunning artillery and slicing through infantry. Others are knocked out at point-blank range by German tanks or guns firing from prepared positions. Assault guns and self-propelled anti-tank guns in the German lines, like Marder III tank destroyers, pump shells into the flanks of passing Soviet tanks. Many tanks on both sides erupt in flames, their ammunition cooking off in sharp blasts. To the north of the main melee, Totenkopf Division has finally managed to bring some of its armour across the Pell River and is engaged by Soviet R&D Guards Rifle Corps and supporting tanks. Totenkopf's panzer crews find themselves navigating through minefields as they attempt to advance toward Prokhorovka from the north. In doing so, they suffer significant tank losses. Hidden Soviet anti-tank guns on the high ground knock out vehicle after vehicle. One by one, half of Totenkopf's panzers are disabled or destroyed. The division's effort to flank Prokhorovka stalls in the afternoon, and Totenkopf essentially fights a separate, furious defensive battle on the division's isolated sector. Back in front of Prokhorovka, the pandemonium continues for hours. Leibstandarte Tigers form a steel backbone in the maelstrom. In one noted action, a platoon of 4 Tigers under SS Lieutenant Franz Staudiger faces an onslaught of Soviet tanks. They hold their ground, firing shell after shell. By battle's end, it's claimed Staudiger's Tigers alone knock out some Soviet tanks, causing the rest to withdraw temporarily. Meanwhile, SS Grenadiers with anti-tank rifles and Panzerfausts dart around on foot, hunting Soviet tanks that have broken through. The air is filled with the crack of tank guns, the hiss of projectiles, the crump of explosions, and the spine-chilling sound of metal tearing. Burning tanks illuminate the battlefield with columns of oily black smoke. Crews bail out of stricken vehicles. Some Soviet and German soldiers even end up in hand-to-hand combat amid wrecks, as infantry from both sides clash. Overhead, the Luftwaffe makes its presence felt despite the hectic dogfights in the sky. German fighters manage to keep many Soviet ground attack planes at bay, maintaining local air superiority over Prokhorovka. Stukas and HS Tankbuster aircraft dive onto Soviet tank columns on the flanks, blasting them with high explosive charges and M&M cannons. Soviet aviation is not absent. Sturmovik attack planes roar in to strafe German positions, though many are intercepted or focus on the flanks rather than the centre of the melee. The airstrikes contribute to the carnage, adding to Soviet tank losses. Still, the brawl on the ground is largely decided by tanks and guns at point-blank range, where bravery and chaos rule. By midday, the initial Soviet attack has spent its fury. The Soviets failed to overrun the SS Panzer Corps or break through to the open rear. The German lines, though dented, have held. In fact, by the afternoon of July, the Soviets have fallen back to their starting positions. The field between the Germans and Prokhorovka is now littered with the smoking carcasses of Tate tanks. Soviet losses are enormous. Rotmistrov later reports up to half of his attacking armour was lost in the first day's assault. German losses in tanks are also severe, particularly in Totenkopf's sector and among some Panzer IV units engaged at close range. However, contrary to Soviet claims that it was a rout of German armour, the German heavy tanks, especially the Tigers, mostly survived the day with relatively fewer losses. Many of the German tank casualties were from mines and mechanical breakdowns, rather than being destroyed outright by enemy fire. As evening approaches on July, sporadic fighting continues, but the great assault is over. Neither side truly won the Battle of Prokhorovka in a tactical sense. The Soviets prevented the Germans from advancing further, and the Germans mauled the Soviet tank reserves badly. Corpses, Crippled tanks and burning vehicles are scattered across the plains around Prokhorovka in ghastly testament to the day's ferocity. The battlefield smells of cordite, charred metal, and death. A German grenadier describes it as a vision from the apocalypse. The carcasses of tanks lie like giant dead elephants on a savanna after a wildfire. Strategically, however, Prokhorovka achieves the Soviet aim. It stops the German advance cold. Hauser's SS Panzer Corps, though intact and still lethal, has lost momentum. Manstein's opportunity to break into open terrain and manoeuvre freely has slipped away. Moreover, events beyond this battlefield are forcing Hitler's hand. Hitler calls off the offensive. On the very evening of July, as the dust settles at Prokhorovka, a crisis meeting takes place at Hitler's forward headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler summons Field Marshals Klug and Manstein to discuss the situation. He has grave news. 2 days earlier, on July, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The Western Allies have opened a new front in the Mediterranean, threatening Italy. At the same time, Soviet Operation Kutuzov has begun up north against the Orel salient, and Model's Ninth Army is now in serious danger of being flanked. Hitler bluntly informs his generals that he intends to discontinue Operation Citadel. Germany cannot fight everywhere at once. Reserves are needed to shore up Italy and defend other sectors. Kluge, whose army group centre is under heavy attack by Kutuzov, actually welcomes this decision. He knows Ninth Army can't advance further and must now pivot to defence. But Manstein is dismayed. In the south, his troops have fought a brutal week and, he believes, are on the cusp of victory. Manstein argues passionately to Hitler that the offensive should continue for a bit longer. In his view, Soviet armoured reserves have been largely spent at Prokhorovka. The Red Army in the south is weakened. If the Germans can press on just a few more days, perhaps they can still achieve a collapse of the Soviet front. On no account should we let go of the enemy until the mobile reserves he has committed are completely beaten, Manstein insists. Hitler, however, is fixated on the broader strategic picture. He agrees only to a minor extension. He authorises Manstein to keep attacking locally in the south for the immediate future, but he simultaneously orders Manstein's last fresh reserve, the X-5 Panzer Corps, to be pulled out and sent south to help the 1st Panzer Army and potentially to Italy. This effectively dooms any hope of renewing the offensive. Manstein's striking force is now being pared down just when he needs reinforcement. For a couple more days, some isolated German attacks continue. On July, Manstein launches Operation Roland, a curtailed attempt to improve positions and perhaps encircle elements of the Soviet State Army near Prokhorovka. But this effort lacks vigour and strength. After 2 days of inconclusive fighting, Hitler's directive comes down to cease all offensive operations. The IISS Panzer Corps is ordered to withdraw from the front. One of its divisions, Liebstandart, is to be detached and sent to Italy post-haste, while the others, Das Reich and Totenkopf, redeploy to meet new Soviet offensives erupting on the Mius River line farther south. It is over. Operation Citadel is cancelled. The German armies are to go over to the defensive. Field Marshal Manstein is bitter. In his post-war memoirs, he would lambast Hitler for calling off the attack, just as, in Manstein's view, a potential victory was within grasp. He argues that the Soviets had committed their strategic reserves and were vulnerable. But, in truth, even Manstein likely underestimated the depth of Soviet reserves remaining. The Stavka had more armies waiting in the wings. For example, the steppe front under Konev with fresh forces that could have been thrown in had the Germans somehow broken through further. The Germans simply lacked the manpower and reserves themselves to sustain a long battle of attrition. Citadel had consumed their striking power rapidly. By aborting the offensive, Hitler perhaps spared the German army even worse losses, but at the cost of forfeiting the last real German initiative on the Eastern Front. For the German soldiers who fought at Kursk, the end comes almost quietly. One SS Panzer officer in Das Reich notes in his diary on July 17th, "We got the order to disengage. We couldn't believe it at first. After all that sacrifice, we are being told to pull back. The men are torn between relief and frustration. Relief, because the maelstrom of fire they had endured was nothing short of hellish. Frustration, because many feel their hard-won gains, scant as they were, are being given up. Units begin an orderly withdrawal to shorter, more defensible lines. Crews scuttle or haul away damaged tanks. Under cover of darkness, columns of trucks, ferry infantry, back out of the salient. The grand offensive that promised so much fanfare ends with a sullen whimper from the German side. One can imagine a scene on July, German grenadiers standing in newly dug foxholes on the defensive, watching the horizon as Soviet probing attacks begin anew. The dust of retreat still hangs in the air. They light cigarettes with trembling hands and wonder what all the sacrifice was for. The mood in many German units is grim. They know they have failed to achieve a decisive victory. Ahead of them, the Red Army is growing ever stronger and bolder. The realization dawns that from now on, the Germans will be reacting to Soviet moves, not the other way around. Aftermath and consequences. Operation Citadel lasted only about 2 weeks, from July to July, yet its impact was enormous. It was the last major offensive the German army would launch in the east. The offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. The Kursk salient remained firmly in Soviet hands. There was no grand encirclement of Soviet forces. Instead, the Germans managed only modest territorial bites on the edges of the bulge, which they soon abandoned anyway. The price of this failure was steep. Exact losses are still debated, but German casualty figures for the battle were roughly men killed, missing or wounded during Citadel, and likely similar numbers in the defensive battles immediately after. They also lost a significant number of tanks. Estimates range from about to German tanks and assault guns destroyed during the offensive, with many more damaged, some repaired later. What's critical is that many of the destroyed tanks were precious Tigers, Panthers and Ferdinands that the Germans could ill afford to lose. The Soviets, by contrast, suffered far higher losses in absolute terms, perhaps 177,000 casualties and over 1,500 tanks destroyed in the defensive phase and the Prokhorovka counterattack. But the Soviet Union's manpower and industrial output could replace those losses relatively quickly. Germany's could not. For the German officers and men, Kursk was a blow to morale. Up to this point, they had harboured some hope that superior German skill and technology could still wrest victory, or at least stalemate from the Soviets. Citadel dashed those hopes. The Soviet soldier had shown himself capable of standing up to the vaunted Panzerwaffe on even terms. The myth of invincibility of the German tank forces was shattered. In German accounts after the war, many admitted that Kursk was the definitive turning point. One panzer commander wrote, "From Kursk onwards, we knew we were on the defensive, that the enemy had endless tanks and would not relent." The aura of inevitability now seemed to favour the Red Army. Strategically, the failure at Kursk meant that the initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviets. Almost immediately, the Red Army went over to a general offensive. In the north, Operation Kutuzov drove the Germans out of the Orel salient by August 5, 1943. In the south, 2 weeks after Citadel's end, the Soviets launched Operation Rumiantsev against the weakened German forces near Kharkov and Belgorod. Manstein's men, without the withdrawn SS divisions, could not hold back this tide. Belgorod fell on August 5th. Kharkov fell by late August after a stubborn fight. By the autumn of 1943, the Germans were in full retreat to the Dnieper River line. The loss of so many experienced tank crews and officers at Kursk also meant the German army had less seasoned leadership to confront the offensives to come. The Luftwaffe, too, began reallocating fighter units to Italy and Western Europe to face the Allied bombing campaign, as noted by historians. By the fall of, only a quarter of the Luftwaffe's day fighters remained on the Eastern Front. The days of German air superiority in the East were over, just as their ground offensive power waned. From Hitler's perspective, Kursk was a personal humiliation. He had delayed and fretted, only to see his gamble fail. He privately told an adjutant, "The thought of it turns my stomach," echoing his earlier dread. Hitler would never again authorize such a large strategic offensive in the East. Henceforth he spoke mostly of forming impregnable defences to bleed the Soviets, but that too would prove illusory. The Nazi leadership tried to mask the defeat. German propaganda initially trumpeted a great defensive victory when, in August, they claimed to have repelled Soviet attacks after Kursk. But the German public, hearing of continual strategic withdrawals, grew anxious. They sensed that Kursk had been a costly failure. For the Soviets and Stalin, Kursk was a monumental triumph. They had not only parried the mightiest blow the Wehrmacht could muster, but they had immediately seized the initiative to liberate their motherland. After Kursk, the Red Army's confidence was at an all-time high. A Soviet tank officer exulted in his journal, "The fascists threw their best at us. Tigers, Panthers, SS elites, and we broke their backs. Now, to finish them off, the strategic initiative indeed belonged to the Soviet Union for the rest of the war." One by one, major cities and regions still under German occupation would be retaken. Kiev by November, then the following year saw the liberation of Belarus, the Balkans. And finally, in the drive into Poland and East Prussia, the battlefields around Kursk became littered graveyards of machines. Wreck recovery teams of both sides towed what they could for scrap or repair. Interestingly, some of the disabled German Panthers and Ferdinands were captured intact by the Soviets, who examined them with interest. A bitter fruit of Hitler's decision to showcase untested technology, Guderian famously quipped after Kursk, "Our offensive was a failure, and the Panthers' performance was a bitter disappointment." He referred to the Panther tank debacle as a fiasco that validated his warnings. The Tiger, while successful in kills, had not been the war-winning weapon either, and many were lost to mechanical issues or being abandoned in retreat. The vaunted Ferdinand tank destroyers, though deadly at long range, they reportedly knocked out dozens of Soviet tanks from afar, proved vulnerable in the end, Soviet. Infantry teams learned to immobilize them with mines or track hits, then swarmed them with grenades and Molotov cocktails since the Ferdinands lacked close-in defences. After Kursk, the surviving Ferdinands were retrofitted with machine guns and renamed Elephants, a telling adaptation learned from the battle. Operation Citadel's failure also exposed a fundamental tension between Nazi political goals and military reality. Hitler had launched it in part for prestige, to show Germany could still strike decisively. He interfered with timing and directed use of new weapons for propaganda effect. But by doing so, he allowed the Soviets to prepare and also diverted resources at critical moments, such as withdrawing divisions early to address political concerns in Italy. Many German generals later argued that they should have been allowed either to attack sooner or not at all, that Hitler's half measure was the worst option. Indeed, by mid-1943, Germany's odds of achieving a win in the East were slim regardless. Kursk merely hastened the decline. After the battle, Hitler is reported to have sighed, "The fruits of this operation are bitter." He increasingly lost faith in his generals and became even more prone to micromanaging defensive stand-fast orders, which would lead to further disasters. For the ordinary German soldier, the summer at Kursk was transformative. Survivors carried scars, physical and mental, from the sheer intensity of that fight. They had witnessed the Red Army's coming of age. No longer were Soviet forces the ill-coordinated, easily panicked masses of. At Kursk they showed tactical skill, effective command, and iron determination. German tank commanders found themselves matched by equally brave and canny Soviet tankers. German infantry faced Soviet Guards rifle divisions that stood their ground or counter-attacked ferociously. The psychological advantage had shifted. After Kursk, it was the Wehrmacht that had to erect defensive lines, the Panther Line on the Dnieper, and hope the Soviets would impale themselves. But unlike the Germans at Kursk, the Soviets would not oblige by launching a foolish frontal assault on prepared positions. Instead, they would use manoeuvres and overwhelming materiel to break German defences in the coming campaigns. In sum, Operation Citadel, from the German perspective, was a story of initial ambition crushed by harsh reality. It showcased the valour and skill of German forces, from panzer aces in their Tigers to grenadiers storming trenches. It demonstrated moments of tactical brilliance and new technology in action. Yet it also revealed the limits of that skill and technology when weighed against a foe with superior numbers, preparation and resilience. The German High Command's internal conflicts and Hitler's meddling certainly did the attackers no favours. Delays gave the Soviets an impregnable advantage. But even had it been launched earlier, one wonders if the outcome would have changed significantly. The Red Army in 1943 was not the same as in 1941. On that blood-soaked stage near Kursk, the curtain fell on Germany's offensive epoch. Never again would the panzers drive deep into Soviet territory. Instead, those same panzer crews would spend the next year desperately plugging gaps and retreating westward, village by village, all the way back to Germany itself. The Battle of Kursk was thus the swan song of German blitzkrieg in the east. From the German perspective, it was a tale of bravery and sacrifice in service of a faltering cause, a dramatic, desperate gamble that ended in failure. As the summer of 1943 waned, soldiers on the German side entrenched and awaited the next hammer blow from the Red Army. Many surely reflected on the past weeks with a mix of pride and bitterness. They had faced an enemy that seemed to only grow stronger. The Eastern Front's momentum had irrevocably shifted. The men and machines Germany lost at Kursk could not be replaced. The men and machines the Soviets lost were replaced twofold. The German army, though still dangerous defensively, would be fighting on the back foot until the war's end. In a broader sense, Kursk sealed the fate of Hitler's ambition to dominate Europe. The Eastern Colossus had not been beaten by guile or courage or technology. The Third Reich was now on the irreversible road to defeat. Operation Citadel, conceived as a grand triumph to turn the tide, instead became the prelude to a long and gruelling German retreat. The echoes of its thunderous battles rolled westward, a portent of the Soviet juggernaut that would, less than 2 years later, reach the ruins of Berlin. The story of Kursk, from the German viewpoint, is thus a powerful, poignant saga, a final blaze of aggressive spirit, ultimately snuffed out by the harsh winds of reality. We appreciate you watching. Subscribe for more history content at timelesshistory.com.